The North Atlantic in March 1943 was a killing ground where steel coffins prowled beneath waves that could crush a man's skull with their pressure. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartmann stood in the control room of U-247, his hands gripping the periscope housing as he watched the depth gauge needle creep past 100 meters, past 150, past 200. Above them, somewhere in the darkness of the pre-dawn ocean, 3 British destroyers hunted with the methodical patience of wolves circling wounded prey. Hartmann was 34 years old, a career naval officer from Hamburg, who had spent the last 3 years of his life inside the cramped, stinking confines of various U-boats. Before the war, he had been a merchant marine officer, navigating cargo ships between German ports and South America. He had loved the open ocean then, loved the sun on his face and the wind in his hair. Now he lived in perpetual twilight, breathing recycled air that tasted of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, commanding 47 men who existed in a state of controlled terror disguised as professionalism. "Depth 220 meters, Herr Kallow," reported Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Becker, the first watch officer. Becker was 26, tall and thin with nervous hands that never stopped moving. He had been with Hartmann for 18 months, had survived 4 patrols that had killed most of their original crew. His face had the grey, wasted look of someone who had stopped sleeping properly months ago. "Level off," Hartmann ordered quietly. His voice was always quiet in combat situations, a habit that had earned him the nickname Der Flüsterer, the whisperer, among his crew. While some U-boat commanders shouted orders and cultivated reputations for aggressive bravado, Hartmann led through calm competence. His men followed him not out of fear or fanaticism, but because he had kept more of them alive than any other commander in the 7th U-boat flotilla. The sound of the destroyer's propellers echoed through the hull like distant thunder. ASDIC pings, the British submarine detection system, rang against U-247's steel skin with a sound like someone tapping on the outside of a metal coffin. Tap, tap, tap. Each ping was a promise of death, a reminder that somewhere above them British sailors were calculating depth and range, preparing to drop depth charges that would either crush the submarine like a tin can or spring leaks that would let the Atlantic flood in and drown them all. "They're directly above us now, Herr Kallow," whispered Lieutenant Otto Zimmermann, the hydrophone operator. Zimmermann was 38, older than most submariners, a former schoolteacher from Bremen who could identify individual ship engines by sound alone. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed the headphones tighter against his ears. 3 destroyers, HMS Vanuk class, speed approximately 15 knots. They're beginning a pattern now. Hartmann knew what that meant. The destroyers would systematically cover the area with depth charges, creating a grid of explosions designed to either destroy the submarine outright or force it to the surface where it could be finished with gunfire. It was the end game of every submarine hunt, and Hartmann had survived it 5 times before. But each time the odds got worse, each time the British tactics got better, each time more of his crew developed the 1,000-yard stare of men who had looked too long into the abyss. "All hands," Hartmann said softly into the intercom. "Silent running. No unnecessary movement. No talking. Conserve air. We ride this out." The crew had heard this before. They moved through the practiced ritual of silence, securing loose equipment, lying still in their bunks, breathing slowly to conserve oxygen. In the control room, only essential personnel remained at their stations. The rest of the submarine was dark and quiet as a tomb. The first depth charge exploded 200 meters off the port side. The sound was like a giant hammer striking the hull, and the submarine shuddered violently. Light bulbs shattered. A pipe joint cracked somewhere aft, sending a fine spray of seawater into the engine room. Hartmann watched the depth gauge needle jump and steadied himself against the plotting table. "Damage report," he said, still quiet. "Minor flooding in engine room, under control," reported Obermaschinist Heinrich Krauser over the intercom. Kraus was 42, the oldest man on the boat, a veteran of the Kaiser's navy in the Great War. He ran the engine room with iron discipline and could repair almost anything with wire and prayers. Hull integrity maintained. No major casualties. The second charge exploded closer, maybe 150 meters. This time the lights went out completely, plunging the control room into darkness, broken only by the dim red glow of emergency lighting. Someone gasped. A young seaman, probably, one of the replacements who had joined them in Lorient 3 weeks ago. Hartmann turned his head in that direction. "Steady," he said. Just one word, but it was enough. The gasping stopped. The third charge was closer still. The explosion was a physical force that lifted the submarine and slammed it sideways. Men were thrown against bulkheads. The depth gauge needle spun wildly. Hartmann tasted blood in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. "Depth?" he asked. 240 meters, Herr Callot. Increasing. We're sinking." The crushed depth, the depth at which water pressure would collapse the hull, was rated at 280 meters for Type 7C U-boats like U-247. But that was the theoretical maximum. In practice, submarines that went below 250 meters rarely came back up intact. "Blow ballast tanks," Hartmann ordered. "Slow ascent. Keep us below 100 meters." But nothing happened. The depth gauge needle continued its downward crawl. 250 meters. 260. "Herr Callot!" Becker's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Ballast tank controls are not responding. The explosion must have damaged the compressed air system." Hartmann felt a cold clarity settle over him, the kind of crystalline calm that came when all options had been exhausted except one. Without ballast control, they couldn't arrest their descent. They would sink until the pressure crushed them, or until they figured out another way to gain buoyancy. And there was only one other way. "Emergency surface," Hartmann said. "Full power to electric motors. All ahead, emergency." It was a desperate gamble. Surfacing would mean facing 3 British destroyers with deck guns and depth charges, emerging into a killing zone where their thin hull would offer no protection. But staying down meant certain death from the depths. At least on the surface they might fight, might surrender, might have some chance. The electric motors screamed as they pushed the submarine upward against its own sinking weight. 270 meters, 260. The hull groaned and creaked, steel under stress, making sounds like a living thing in pain. Rivets popped with sounds like gunshots. A seam split in the pressure hull, and water began spraying in with enough force to cut skin. "Seal that breach!" Hartmann shouted, no longer whispering. "All hands to damage control!" Men scrambled in the darkness, fighting the water, fighting the descent, fighting for their lives. Hartmann watched the depth gauge like a man watching his own execution. 250 meters, 240. They were climbing now, the electric motors draining the battery at an unsustainable rate, but giving them precious buoyancy. 200 meters, 150. They were going to make it. And then the electric motors died, drained batteries finally giving out with a mechanical sigh that sounded like surrender. The submarine's upward momentum carried them for a few more precious seconds, and then they hung suspended in the water column at 100 meters depth, neither sinking nor rising. "Battery power exhausted, Herr Callot," Becker reported. "We have no propulsion. Emergency lighting only." Hartmann calculated quickly. They were still deep enough that the destroyers above could finish them with depth charges, But they were also light enough now that without power to drive them down, they would slowly bob to the surface like a cork. It would take maybe 20 minutes, and then they would emerge directly beneath the guns of 3 British warships. "All hands," Hartmann said over the intercom. "Prepare to surface and abandon ship. Make ready life vests. Mechanics, prepare scuttling charges." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. In 3 years of war, he had never surrendered a boat. He had brought U-247 through 11 patrols, had sunk 23 Allied ships, totaling over 90,000 tons, had become one of the most successful commanders in the Kriegsmarine, and now it was ending here, in the cold North Atlantic, with his crew swimming in freezing water waiting to be fished out by the British. "Herr Kalu." It was Obersteuermann Paul Weber, the chief helmsman. Weber was 31, from Kiel, a submariner since 1937. He had a wife and 3 children he hadn't seen in 2 years. "Permission to speak freely?" "Granted." "The men, some of them don't want to surrender. They've heard stories about what happens to U-boat crews in British camps, and they're afraid of what will happen to their families back home if they're taken prisoner. Dönitz has made it very clear. Surrendering is not an option." Hartmann knew what Weber was really saying. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had issued increasingly harsh directives about fighting to the last. Submarine commanders who surrendered faced court-martial if they returned home. Their families faced investigation by the Gestapo, accusations of treason by association. The Nazi regime had made survival itself a crime. "What are you suggesting, Weber?" The helmsman's face was grey in the dim emergency lighting. "The men want to know if there's another option, Herr Kalu. If we could stay down, go deeper, end it on our own terms rather than face capture and what comes after." Hartmann felt a cold hand grip his heart. Weber was proposing suicide, taking the entire crew down to crush depth deliberately rather than surfacing. It was the ultimate form of defiance, the final gesture of control in a situation where they had none. It was also murder. 47 men who might survive in British captivity, 47 families who would receive telegrams saying "lost at sea" instead of "prisoner of war." "How many of the crew feel this way?" Hartmann asked quietly. "Most of them, Herr Kalu. Maybe 30, 35 men, the younger ones especially. They believe what the propaganda says about what the British do to prisoners." Hartmann thought about his own family, his mother in Hamburg, his younger sister working in a factory, his father who had died in the Great War and thus was spared seeing his son face this choice. If he surrendered, would the Gestapo come for them? Would his sister be fired, his mother questioned, the family name blackened? And yet, he looked around the control room at the faces of his crew. Becker, the nervous first officer who quoted Goethe and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Zimmermann, the former schoolteacher who wrote letters to his students between patrols. Krauss in the engine room, who had been torpedoed twice in World War I and had volunteered for submarines again anyway because it was the only life he knew. These men trusted him absolutely. Whatever he decided, they would follow. "Herr Kalu," Becker interrupted, "we're ascending again. Slowly, but we're rising. We'll breach in approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes to decide. 15 minutes to choose between surrender and annihilation, between survival and honor, between living with shame or dying with pride. Hartmann closed his eyes and tried to hear something beyond the creaking hull and the distant propellers, some voice of wisdom, some moral clarity. But there was only the ocean and the silence. "Sir, the British are signalling," Zimmermann reported, listening to his hydrophones. "They're broadcasting in German. They're saying they know we're damaged, that they'll rescue survivors, that we should surface and surrender immediately." The British were offering mercy. not out of kindness necessarily, but because they followed their own codes, their own rules of war that said even enemies deserved a chance at life. Hartmann thought about those British sailors above, men not so different from his own crew, doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive this war. They had families too, fears too, doubts too. "Weber," Hartmann said finally, "tell the crew this. We are going to surface. We are going to surrender. And anyone who thinks that makes us cowards or traitors can answer to me personally. We have fought honourably for 3 years. We have done our duty. But our duty does not extend to suicide, and it does not extend to dragging 47 men to their deaths because we're afraid of what might happen if we survive. The British will treat us according to the Geneva Convention. Our families will know we're alive. And when this war ends, and it will end, perhaps sooner than Berlin admits, we will go home. That is my decision. Does anyone wish to challenge it?" Silence in the control room. Then Weber saluted. "No, Herr Kallu, we follow your orders." 10 minutes later, U-247 broke the surface of the North Atlantic into the grey dawn light. The conning tower hatch opened, and Hartmann climbed out with his hands raised, followed by his officers. The 3 British destroyers surrounded them like circling sharks, their deck guns trained on the helpless submarine. A loud hailer crackled to life. "This is HMS Vanuk. Abandon your vessel immediately. Prepare to be taken aboard." Hartmann ordered the scuttling charges set with a 5-minute delay, enough time for everyone to evacuate, but not enough time for the British to board and capture the boat intact. U-247 would go down, but on their terms, denied to the enemy as a prize. It was a small victory, but it was something. The crew filed out of the submarine in orderly fashion, climbing into life rafts, while the British sailors watched warily. They were professionals, these enemies. They didn't gloat or jeer, just pulled the German sailors from the freezing water with the same efficiency they would have shown their own men. Hartmann was the last to leave, standing on the conning tower as the scuttling charges counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2. He jumped into the water just as the charges exploded. U-247 shuddered, rolled onto her port side, and began to slip beneath the waves. Hartmann tread water, watching his command disappear into the depths. 3 years of his life, 11 patrols, 23 ships sunk, 2 Iron Crosses earned, and it all came down to this: floating in the North Atlantic while British sailors threw him a line. They pulled him aboard HMS Vanuk, wrapped him in a blanket, gave him hot tea that tasted like medicine. A British officer approached, a lieutenant commander, perhaps 35, with kind eyes and a weary expression. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reynolds, captain of HMS Vanuk. You're Hartmann, aren't you? We've been hunting you for 6 months. You're quite good at this game." Hartmann didn't respond, just stared at the oil slick where his submarine had gone down. "Your crew will be treated well," Reynolds continued. "Medical attention, food, dry clothing, then transport to a POW camp. Nothing unpleasant, I promise you. We're not barbarians." He paused. "I know this isn't easy. Surrendering never is. But you made the right choice. Your men will live to see the end of this war. That's worth something." "Is it?" Hartmann asked bitterly. "My career is over. My reputation destroyed. When I return to Germany, they'll call me a coward." Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll call you the commander who brought his men home alive. Perspective changes when the war ends, Captain. What seems like shame today might look like wisdom tomorrow. You'll see." Hartmann didn't believe him. Not then. But 3 years later, sitting in a British POW camp in Yorkshire, receiving a letter from his mother saying she was alive and well and proud of him for surviving, he began to understand what Reynolds had meant. And 5 years after that, when he returned to a defeated Germany to find his sister married and his mother healthy, and the Third Reich nothing but ashes and bad memories, he understood completely. In 1962, 17 years after the war ended, Hartmann received an invitation to a reunion of U-boat commanders in Hamburg. He almost didn't go, afraid of facing men who had fought to the bitter end, who had sacrificed everything for a cause that had been rotten from the start. But he went anyway, and found that most of the veterans there were like him, survivors who had chosen life over death, who had surrendered when surrender was the only sane option. They told their stories over beer and schnapps, these old men who had been young warriors. Some had scuttled their boats in the final days, some had been captured, some had made it back to German ports only to find them occupied by Allied forces, and a few, a very few, had never surrendered, had fought until their ammunition ran out, and their boats were sunk beneath them. "Do you regret it?" someone asked Hartmann, "surrendering when you did?" Hartmann thought about U-247 lying somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, about the 47 men who had surfaced with him that March morning in 1943, about the 32 who had survived the war in POW camps and returned home. He thought about Weber, the helmsman who had suggested suicide, who now ran a boatyard in Kiel and had 5 grandchildren. He thought about Becker, who had become a teacher as he'd always dreamed, who wrote Hartmann letters every year on the anniversary of their surrender. He thought about all the men who had lived because he chose the surface over the depths. "No," Hartmann said, "I don't regret it. I chose life, for myself and my men. That was the right choice, even if it didn't feel like it at the time." An older commander, one of the few who had fought to the end and somehow survived, raised his glass. "To Hartmann," he said, "the captain who chose wisely. May we all have such courage when the time comes." They drank to that, these ghosts of the Kriegsmarine, these men who had learned that true courage isn't dying for a lost cause. It's choosing to live when living is the harder path. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartmann died in 1983 at the age of 74, surrounded by family, his service record both proud and complicated. His obituary in the German Naval Journal noted his successful career as a U-boat commander, but also his controversial decision to surrender rather than fight to the death. The debate about whether he had made the right choice continued long after he was gone, but in the end, perhaps the only metric that matters is this. Of the 47 men who served under him on that final patrol, 32 survived the war. That's 32 fathers who came home to their children, 32 sons who reunited with their mothers, 32 lives that continued because one captain chose the surface over the depths, surrender over annihilation, hope over despair. The depths would have kept their secrets forever. But Hartmann chose to let his men tell their stories, to live their lives, to find meaning beyond war. And in that choice, he found a kind of victory that no number of tonnage sunk could ever match.